Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Welcome in. I'm glad you're here for this great conversation. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you that a great way to help support me, help support the podcast, is by making a small donation. And you can do that by going to buymeacoffee.com, all one word, /coolgrandpa. And on there, you can buy me a slice of pizza. Now, those are in $5 increments. So if you want to buy me a slice, that's great. If you want to buy me a whole pizza, that's awesome. All that money goes to just help offset some of the production costs that I have to just keep putting out the Cool Grandpa podcast. Any support you give would be fantastic. And I've also got a link to buymeacoffee.com on my website as well. So if you forget about this website that I just told you about, you can easily find it over on the cool-grandpa.us website. Scott Rammage is joining us to talk to us about the impact that his grandfathers had on his life, how they really influenced him to become the man that he is, as well as the entrepreneur that has been able to start multiple businesses, has also been able to start an awesome project that we will be talking about, which is called the Brotherhood of Fatherhood. Now, Scott is a fantastic motivator and somebody with a lot of wisdom on how to help guys get out of the ruts and some of the self-defeating behaviors that we often engage in that really slow us down, that keep us from being the best fathers, the best grandfathers that we can be. So you're really going to enjoy this conversation, and without further ado, let's jump into it. Hi, Scott. Welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. I'm excited to have you on the program this evening.
Man, Greg, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It was such a blast being on the Brotherhood of Fatherhood, getting to know you, getting to know the purpose of that organization that you have up and going. And I just really wanted to connect with you again on my podcast so that we could talk about the Brotherhood of Fatherhood, as well as your interaction and your memories and influence of your grandfather. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always fun to spend some time going back in time, if you will.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's one of these things, too, when I'm talking with people that oftentimes find out, they don't have these conversations very much. Maybe at some kind of family event when people are sitting around telling stories or whatever, it comes out. But day to day, these memories and these lessons don't really pop up too much.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so funny. Even today, there are a lot of things were running through my head because, when I think you just push them back into the back and they lay a foundation for your life for sure. Right. Like there's so much there. There's so much. And then when you start to think about it, all this stuff wells up, good and bad, of course.
The other thing too, is that it's fun to both reminisce a little bit, but then also I think if you take a little bit of a truthful eye, maybe critical eye, and look for some of those missteps that may have happened, just because we're all human, we're all trying to do the best we can, but those are the lessons learned, right? Those are the things where it's like, oh, if I'm ever in this spot, instead of doing what granddad did or what my dad did, here's what I'm going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the fail forward. Even through failures of ourselves and others, we can learn something from it. So that's how life is. It's a gift. And if you think everything's bad, you just need to switch it a little bit and think about how you can learn from those things that happen that are awesome. And so it's the opposite. If things are good, you can look at those and unpack it. And we just have a wealth of opportunity, and starting back from our very earliest relationships in our family, our parents, our grandparents, aunts and uncles and cousins. There's just so much wealth there, if you will.
Let's go ahead and dive in to talking about your grandfathers, and then we'll pivot back a little bit later to the Brotherhood of Fatherhood. But how about you introduce your grandfathers to us? Give us a little bit of their background so we get to know them.
Oh, man. So I've learned a lot, of course, after they passed away, which is always interesting. My mother's father was the one that I didn't know a lot about until he was gone from this earth. And he was always quiet, and we always thought of him as grumpy. And he was the guy, when we'd go to their house, he would go out to the shop and be smoking and working on the car and working on the lawn. It was almost like he was always avoiding us. And it's so curious because I always liked him. I always liked, everyone said he was grumpy. I always liked him. He had just this wit or this sense of humor that was dry. And I think a lot of people misunderstood him. But I got older, and then when I got married, I had never seen somebody laugh so much in my life, because my wife is a woman of joy. She loves laughing, and he fell in love with her. She got him. She saw the humor at a whole new level, and it literally opened my eyes. And so here's this guy that everyone said was grumpy. He was always around, which was really cool, right? He worked really hard. He came from a very, very, very hard background, and, just was a janitor at the local community college for years and years and years. And he just had to work all the time. And, it's one of those things where you can kind of look back and see how everything that he had experienced was unpacking and why he was the way he was. But I have so much adoration for him. I mean, at Christmas, I still have, we moved probably like 3 months ago, and I was unpacking some of the things, and I have this little box that I stored away, this little metal box that I stored away from being a kid. And in it is a bar of soap or a soap box. And in the soap box is a rock. And it was and then there was a note, just hand scratched note. That was his Christmas gift to me, was a rock in a box of soap. And I don't recall what it was, what was written on that, but it was his way of humor. And who would keep a soap box with a rock in it, right? But I think that represents kind of the uniqueness of him. And I fell in love with that uniqueness. And then my wife was able to draw me into more of that uniqueness. And as he got older and older, I got closer and closer. And it was an incredible, incredible relationship. And what I learned later, and I think this is a really important thing for people to understand and maybe unpack in their own families, is that my mother and her sisters had a lot of unresolved things from their past. And it turns out that a lot of those they thought they were mad at him. But once their mother passed away, they learned a lot about their dad and realized that all the blame was thrown into him, and they forced all of their anger and frustration and the experiences and living in poverty on him. But then they realized, wait a minute, this was a 2-person show, right? And it was a really interesting experience that opened up once some of the baggage was gone, and really who this man was. He was an extraordinary man, and he loved his grandkids greater than you can imagine. And so it's just, that was my mom's father, and I just have nothing but adoration for him. He literally would hitchhike from southern Oregon up to northern Washington like 2 or 3 times a year, just to work. And just his life was it was rich with lots of stories. So yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, other than there's just so much richness out there. And I never really got to spend time alone with him. There was never an opportunity to spend time alone with him until he started to invite me and my wife over. And that's when we got to tell stories with him and hear his stories. So those opportunities were absolutely incredible. On the other hand was my grandfather from my dad's father. He was another working man, and he worked really, really, really hard. And his whole life was focused on retirement. All I remember when he was working is that he was working to retire. And all I remember when he was retired is that he was celebrating retirement. And he was a fisherman. He loved fishing. So I learned how to fish. I just spent a lot of time on the lake with him. We had a cabin up in the lake up in Oregon near Crater Lake. It was a lake called Dimond Lake. We had a cabin. I would snowmobile in there in the winter. You couldn't get in. There was no roads open. So you'd have to snowmobile in. And so I did a lot of hard things with him, and I learned a lot of really incredible skills. He actually taught me how to mow the lawn. I mowed the lawn with my dad, but I remember mowing the lawn for him. And he would say the things that my dad wouldn't say. So he'd say, hey, like, you missed the spot. And now that I have, teenage kids, I'm like, you missed the spot. But I also remember he hired me to paint his barn, and he's like, man, you took a lot of vacations. I'm like, well, what do you mean? He's like, all those spaces you missed, those are each a vacation or a holiday or whatever it was. I just remember that there was a lot of focus on perfectionism, but really what I remember was that you take pride in your work. And I don't know where I'm going. I just have so fond of memories of both of them, even though they had their shortcomings. They both, in the right time, spent time with me.
Oh, sure. Well, and one of the things that sounds like it's coming across is, one, they're both really hard workers, maybe for different objectives or whatnot, but they had that work ethic. And the other part, too, is being able to communicate with you. Now, it sounds like your mother's father, that came a little bit later, but being able to say things to you that maybe mom and dad couldn't say, wouldn't say, and being able to be that source of truth, for lack of a better word, with you.
Yeah, it just stark contrast between them. They both came up from really hard times. I wish I could do the dates better, but we're talking early 1900s, right? And things were really hard. And they both were brought up in like severe poverty. And one had worked his way up in organizations working as a construction worker, then being construction worker manager, and then overseeing big projects. And that was my dad's dad. And then my other grandfather just kind of staying at the same position his whole life and being loyal to that. And I think there's just so many rich lessons that come from that. I'm very entrepreneurial. Neither of them that as far as I could tell, were entrepreneurial at all. They were company men. And I think as an entrepreneur, there's just so many deep-seated lessons that I take from the way that they worked. It's like, for me, it's like how I do anything is how I do everything. So when I go and mow my lawn, that represents how I treat my wife. And I know that's a stretch for many people, but little lessons that I pull and I start to think about that I pulled from, they seem so basic when you're young. They seem like you're being nitpicky or, why does it matter? But when you get older, you start to kind of put the pieces together, and they laid that foundation along with my father. I had an amazing father, but they laid that foundation. And one was the grandfather my dad's dad would shower us with gifts at Christmas. It was the big payoff, right? And the other one was, I got a rock,
Mm-hmm.
And there's just so much richness in each of those. So I don't know what your question, I don't remember what your question was, but.
No, we were just kind of contrasting a little bit. And then also just bringing up the level of influence that they had on you and being able to communicate at different times about, those gaps in the painting of the fence or whatnot. But the other thing that's amazing too, that I love capturing these stories, is that you and I are really similar age. I think we're probably within like 2 or 3 years of each other. And so these grandfathers that we had that were born in 1918, 1919, that went through that, especially my grandfather on my mom's side was out in the Utah, Oregon area. So kind of similar where, it was poverty until really, I think they hit the 60s, and the U.S. economy in general kind of lifted everybody up. Yeah, I remember my grandfather being very frugal. My grandmother had to whip him into shape a little bit. If we were going into town to get something, he was like, well, here's a couple of dollars, literally. And grandma would be like, a couple of dollars isn't getting these grandkids anything. You open up that wallet there, Walt. Get him a little bit more.
That generation is interesting. One memory, I'm sorry to interrupt, but one memory is my grandparents were doing very well. They bought a very nice house. They had a lot of property right on the river. They had their lake cabin. They worked really hard for that retirement life, right?
Mm-hmm.
But all I remember is you got to put a quarter in a jar if you leave a light on in the room. Like, it was so ingrained. It just brought up that funny memory for me.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I'm sure, too, that you probably remember the times where you probably talked with the grandparents Sunday evenings, like after 6 o'clock, when the telephone rates would be dropped down. And those lessons that we have, right? Because our kids sometimes don't believe us. And I tell people that we've got about 100 years of family history in us that we can reach back and share, right? Because we've heard stories about grandpa growing up when he was a little kid, grandpa during the war and depression, these different things. We heard it from firsthand sources, and now we're able to pass those things forward into people where, you know, it's almost like living in a time where you heard people talk about the Civil War while you're driving to the drive-in to go see a movie and get a hamburger. It's that kind of a gap in time, I think.
That's really incredible to think about. And it's a little bit of reality when I'm talking to my oldest is 19, my youngest is 15, when I'm talking to them and I'm trying to explain sitting next to the radio, waiting for a certain song to play to push record. They're like, on what? Like a tape player, just like, and before that it was 8 tracks. Like, what in the world is 8 track? Well, my grandparents had one in their car, and, and records. And it's just such a massive stretch of time between grandparents and their grandkids. It's large.
Yeah. Yeah. And that influence that we have going forward with the grandchildren, right? Because it's those lessons learned that you were being instilled with, as far as making sure the lawn was cut right, the job at the barn was done right, probably stuff around your other grandfather's workshop was back where it needed to be and where he wanted it to be, and that kind of exactness that I think just carries forward. And like you said, with your business, there's certain things we do it this way because of these reasons. Sloppiness gets us into trouble.
This is such a funny circle of conversations. I'm going to get off topic a little bit, but I actually am reading a book, Discipline is Destiny by Ryan Holiday. And there's a quote in there, and I just took it and I popped it up on Facebook with a picture of my desk. My desk is very organized. There's like 4 hats on them, and there's a reason, because when I'm on video calls all the time. Who I'm talking to will dictate which hat I have on. I have a conversational hat. I have my Brotherhood of Fatherhood hat. I have these different hats, right? But the whole point was, like, everything in my office has an order. It says if you operate with a messy desk, you will be okay with sloppy work. And I posted that with no context behind it and a picture of I think I poked the bear on that one. So many people were upset and arguing with me about how amazing. But then having this conversation, it pulls right back to where that foundation was probably laid. That was, if you're coming from the Depression, if you're coming from an era where there was very little and you were very particular with what you had, things in orderliness and neatness, were important.
Right.
And so it's just funny. It kind of came full circle as you were explaining that.
No, and there is an area in personality where some clutter is, you can kind of work around through that.
Oh, heck yeah.
But the thing is that you're talking about are those grandparents If they're buying a tool, and they're taking care of it. It goes on the pegboard and it goes right here. And they're looking at stuff like when Craftsman used to really be a thing, where if you busted that wrench and you sent it in or gave them a call, they would send you a replacement.
Oh man, I remember that.
And you'd pay a little bit of extra money, and our grandparents would do that. It'd be, how do we make this thing last? How do we make, a good purchasing decision?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's so much to learn from that, right? Right.
Oh.
I mean, there is a ton to learn from that. And I did learn that there are some really high performing people who have very messy pasts.
Yeah. But overall, I think the whole thing is definitely, make sure that the work environment, make sure everything's cleaned up. One of the things I liked when I was at UPS was that you had to have a clean desk. Like they would have people walk around after hours and kind of give you a little note. Like if you had too much stuff that was laying around because you needed to get your stuff back in the file cabinet, you had to have stuff, just so. And there was part of that was the exactness and wanting to be, for them, as professional. And you can say it's old school, whatever, kind of the environment of Big Blue when everybody wore blue suits that worked at IBM. But there's a benefit to that because it did force you at the beginning of the day to come into a clean environment. At the end of the day, make sure everything's packed up, put away.
Yeah. My grandpa would always tell me, he's like, if you move, this is very interesting. He had a very nice shop. He's like, if you move a tool and you use it, you put it right back where it went. Because when I'm doing a project, I don't want to have to look for it because it's a waste of my time and I can't do the project the best of my ability. Yeah. And, thinking of UPS, you're talking about logistics. You can't make mistakes in logistics. Everything's got to be accurate. You can't send something like, one zip code over. It doesn't work that way. So it actually makes really good sense. And it's just so crazy how thinking through my upbringing and my time around my grandparents, how that formed me into who I am today. Like I never put that into line of like why I like order in my working space. Probably has a lot to do with that being ingrained from a very early age, learning how to turn a wrench with my grandpa, eventually owning my own bike shop and me being in like disarray all the time because my employees would put stuff where they didn't belong. But I love the history. I love the legacy in all the different ways that come from grandparents. And it's exciting for me to think about me being a grandparent and being able, the absolute impact that has. But here's the thing, you and I both know, in order to have that impact, you have to be present.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And thinking in terms of that, what are some of the lessons? What are some of the memories from your grandfathers that you think you're going to incorporate into your future relationships? Have you even thought about that?
I've thought about it a little more since kind of connecting with you, having you on the podcast and kind of discussing some of these things. For me, from my mom's dad, I don't want people to misunderstand who I am. And so he was so quiet and pulled back for so many years until we kind of broke through that I never got to know him until I was older. And that's a sad thing because I think I could have had much more laughter with him because I understood his humor once I understood that he was actually funny. Right. But my grandpa on my father's side, I spent a lot of time with him. And so it's just really practical things like how to gut a fish. He would get me up at 4:30 a.m. to go fishing. So, and there was no complaining. Like, this is a gift. You get to go fishing. No complaining. And from a lot of modeling. And that is where I've seen some things really go wrong with some grandparents, is in like expecting perfection from their grandkids when really it's that relationship is a great opportunity to just let them try and to just experience but also watch the grandparent do it with, the execution that someone older would do. My boys, we flew my 15-year-old up to Oregon, and my 19-year-old drove from Montana over to Oregon for a week-long vacation to visit their grandparents this summer. And my son, my 15-year-old, came home. He's like, he calls him Papa. I just really like how Papa would say, okay, here's how you use the saw. Here's where you need to be safe. Here's your block of wood. And he's like, he would just let us try. And if we messed up, he'd be like, here's another block of wood. He wouldn't jump in and show them exactly how to do it. But at the same time, he was next to them doing his own work. So that he's like, I was watching him, and then I would go do it. And he's like, so when it was time to, he made a wood sword. He's like, when it was time to sharpen the sword, he literally handed me the orbital sander. He's like, you just keep moving it in the direction that you want until it's the shape you want. And that was the instructions he gave. And then my dad stood back and took candid video my boys didn't know. And it was just like this moment, like it's ingrained in my head, but it's also, more importantly, it's ingrained in my son's head. He's like, I just really loved experiencing it and not perfection being expected.
Right.
And that really spoke a lot to me about how I want to be as a grandfather. Just do the things beside, model that activity, because it's so easy for us as adults to say, this is how you do it, but not necessarily do it. And that's that's the worst thing you can do.
Yeah. And I think as fathers, we tend to do that so much more because we do want the kids to understand what grades really do reflect as they advance through school, what certain hobbies and certain skills and certain things really do have an impact further down the road. And as kids, they're normal. Their life is like, what's going to happen by next Saturday? Past Saturday, who knows what's going on? But our views get longer. And I think as fathers, we put that pressure on them to be perfect or be striving for that perfection. That's not always in their skill set, not always in their personality. But I think as grandfathers, we get a chance to, like you said, we can step back. We can give some basic instruction, some safety, and then step back and go ahead and let them fail, because we know failing is part of the process. And you only get there after being a father for a while and having a certain amount of age, if you're intentional and if you're open to learning those lessons.
It's a difference between, there's a book I read, I wish I could quote it right now. My eyesight's too bad, I can't see the stand here, but there's a book I read where it kind of laid out the stages from boyhood all the way up to, patriarch. And mentor. After fatherhood, there's a stage in fatherhood, then it goes mentor and then patriarch. I think at the patriarch level, you're thinking on such a more long-term basis. Instead of like, you have to have the lawn mown perfectly, because this is how I would do it. Like, you miss a spot, go out and fix it. You didn't do this right. You need to keep straight lines, all of that. I was looking at the short term, let's get it done right, or let's get it done now. From that patriarchal view, when you're more concerned about character, and I'm totally concerned about character as a father, but I look at the way I would do that with a grandson now, thinking about that, and the way I did it with my own boys, I do it totally different because the pressure is off, and I'm looking at a long term, the long game. I'm looking at that long legacy game, and it doesn't go lost. I will tell a story. I taught my boys how to mow the lawn, how to weed eat, all of that. My oldest is horrible at it. Absolutely horrible. Always missed spots, never straight, didn't care. I would say, look, it was like 3 inches taller in the spot. He's like, I cannot see. I physically cannot see a difference there. And I'm like pulling my hair out. You know what he's done this summer? He's been working his butt off on a huge ranch, and he's been in charge of all the common area lawns. And he sends me pictures all the time of like these perfectly manicured lawns with immaculate straight lines. And he talks about like the pitch and what kind of lawnmower you use in each place.
Oh my.
And, I think as fathers, we get in our own way so many times, but I thought that was funny.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like that thing where when you're having your parent-teacher conference and your kids are at an age where they're really bratty to you at home and there's some conflict and it's just their growing pains, right? But you go sit down with this teacher and the teacher's like, most respectful kid, helps everybody out, always raises their hand, is ready. And it's like, where the heck is this kid? Why aren't you sending him home?
I taught middle school for 13 years, and I heard that every single teacher conference. Like every time I do teachers, not for every kid, obviously, but every year, every quarter, I would hear a parent saying, what kid is in your classroom? Because that is not mine.
Right. Yeah.
Because we're so close. We're so close, right?
Yep.
And there's a different relationship there. And I think that's the majesty of a grandparent is you get to influence and be there, but then they go away. They go back home. Right.
Yep.
And then you get to swoop back in and you're refreshed and you get to enjoy the moment. And I think at that age, our age, we're going to enjoy that so much more because we get the bigger, longer term picture.
Absolutely. And I think to your point too, as we're getting older, both as just older fathers and then grandfathers, having that longer term view and really focusing in that character makes up so much of what goes in what we want for these kids. That starts to become really much more the focus versus the skill set.
Yeah. A great example of that is my 15-year-old he's destined to be an entrepreneur like me. I mean, he's been dead set on it forever. He has the personality, a little bit of the anti-authoritarian personality, which is very common among entrepreneurs, business owners, which I had. But he speaks it, he talks about it. And last year, it's where he's like, this class in school is an absolute, utter, complete waste of my time. He's like, I get my work done in the first 5 minutes. The rest is just a bunch of kids screwing off, and he doesn't see the value of it. And so he stopped doing assignments.
Oh.
And this is where, as a parent, I'm coming in with that short term, but also as I started to think about it and where I'm at now in my life, I'm like, hey, look, sure, this class is kind of useless. It's nothing you're going to do anything, but here's what you can learn from it. You can learn about your character. You can learn about how you do anything is going to mold you in how you do everything. And we are Rammages, and Rammages finish what we start, and we do it with the most excellence we can. And it has nothing to do about following authority at that point. It has nothing to do about the value of it in the long term of your life, because the value of it in the long term of your life is learning that lesson right there. And he's, but that's you and I are getting up there in age, so we see things differently.
Yeah. Scott, I do want to pivot over and talk about the Brotherhood of Fatherhood. And I'd love for you to walk us through about how you created this organization and even a movement, if that's not, too strong of a word for what you've got going on here.
So you look at the richness of my upbringing, an incredible father, very, very amazing dad. I loved my grandparents, my grandfathers, absolutely loved them. They were, especially, later years, they were very mentoring to me, and those big picture guidance things, they were in my life. But we all lived in the same town forever. So I had this circle, I had this support structure. I saw these people who were sewing into me my entire life. Of course, I went off to grad school, college and then grad school, but I moved back to that small town. And in 2016, I picked up my family, sold my business, picked up my family, and moved to Texas. And about a year into that, I was realizing that I didn't have that circle of men anymore. Sure, they were distant, but I didn't have them like I had in the past. And so I was like, man, I need to be a part of men. I started to see where guys were kind of messing up. And it started to really irritate me. And I started to really go through a personal growth process. And prior to that, but it's like, man, guys are screwing up. They're focusing on their work when they need to be focusing on their family. They're not focusing on the right things. They're wasting time doing X, Y, and Z instead of being intentional with their kids and their wives and their relationships. And I was frustrated. I was incredibly frustrated. I was looking around going, man, every guy around me is chasing a career at the cost of everything. And so I started looking at all the different organizations, like, what do I want to join? What do I want to join? And I was talking to my best friend at the time, and he's like, you don't seem like much of a follower. And I'm like, no, I don't want to join any of these guys and what they're doing. I said, I think I just want to create my own. And so through long conversations with him, he came up with the name, the Brotherhood of Fatherhood. And it created a flip for me. What had happened was he had one son and he felt like he wasn't doing good as a father and a husband. And he finally told me after like 2 years of just talking every single day, he's like, Scott, you've taught me so much about being a good husband. You've taught me so much about being a father. And I've learned so much. You need to do something and I'll do it with you. And it's called the Brotherhood of Fatherhood. That was literally the conversation. I was like, that flipped a switch. And from that moment on, it was just a journey of like, what does this look like? And it started with podcasting. Mm-hmm. And then podcasting turned into just meeting hundreds of men. I started, the very first thing I did, actually, you'll like this. Very first thing I did is I called grandfathers. I called it my legacy project. I didn't record any of it, which was nuts.
Oh, wow.
I'd call these guys and I'd be like, hey, can I have an hour with you on Zoom? They're like, sure. Like, what's Zoom? Most of them. And I'm like, but what I did is I found men that I knew who had raised now successful adults. I thought, this is the path. This is the way where I learn how to be the man who can raise my children to be successful human beings. And so I did hundreds of hours of interviewing men. Again, none of them recorded. But I went through this journey and learned so much, all these different pieces. And then I started just getting on Zoom with regular men and recording them and making the podcast out of it. And now I've, interviewed hundreds and hundreds of men and enjoyed every moment of it and learned so much. You had a lot of guests that I've learned how not to do things from, a lot of them how to do things from. And over time, that's kind of morphed into, it's more of a leadership, how to lead your family, how to be the best husband, how to be the best father, and how to be best for your community. And that's really the overarching theme. A lot of entrepreneurs in that, because that's just how I operate. It's the way my brain works. So that draws them. And started doing events and have seen just incredible breakthroughs in men by exposing them to real common conversations. We use the term that you use a lot, is intentionality. When we start to live with intentionality in our marriage, we in turn are modeling an incredible relationship to our kids. And when we model that incredible relationship to our kids, they in turn will pick those things up and marry somebody with that intentionality. And they'll marry someone with a lot more tools in place, and they'll be better fathers, and they'll be better, husbands. And it's for me, it's this like really taking a mirror and saying, hey, men, look at yourself. Who are you really? And where are you messing up really? And it's time to address those things and move forward and improve your life.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what I do.
No, I love it. And a question I've got for you along those lines with everybody that you've been talking to, or what are some of the challenges that our adult sons may be facing now as fathers that maybe we're not aware of? Because it's been 20 years, 30 years, whatever that is, since we were young fathers ourselves.
One of the biggest ones is identity and purpose. So young fathers fall into a trap. I've seen it over and over and over again. And I'll also lay out a pattern I've noticed is there is a point in your life, if you are sort of making it, where there's a switch and all of a sudden you have kids and you believe that in order to provide for them means to earn a lot of money. If I can earn more money, we'll have this. My kids will have a better life. And what happens is that gets perverted. And us as intuitive providers, as the killer and the feeders, we feed our family, we turn into that and we focus so into that we actually neglect the time we have with our kids. We neglect the time we have with our wife. That's one of them. And so our purpose or our identity starts to become wrapped up in work. And this lasts for years and years and years. And that is, I'll put it out there. It is a really bad path to go down. Mm-hmm. If work was taken from you today, would you still be the man you were yesterday? It better be yes, because work can be taken from you at any time. And so your identity is so misaligned that you focus everything in on it and lose the moments with your family. That's something I see happening over and over and over again. A pattern that I've seen in interviewing these young men, especially entrepreneurs, is they start their business before they're first born, or right when they're first born comes along. I started my first business. I was teaching and owned a brick and mortar business when my son was born. It's like all of a sudden this flip switched. I'm like, instead of working for other people in the summer, I'm going to build my own business. My wife's like, what? And so when she needed me the most, I went into another direction and just worked 100 hours a week, just grinding. And so all in the name of providing for my family.
Right.
So another one that I've seen quite often, and this is going to ruffle a few feathers probably, is men, when they have kids, turn all of their attention to their kids and neglect their relationship. And what that does is when the kids leave home, guess what happens? They almost always divorce, because you've now lived a parallel life with your spouse and you've forgotten why you got married in the first place, and you've allowed yourself to separate emotionally because you're putting everything into your kids. And so that's why I believe that to be the best father, your role is to be the best husband, because that's a trickle down effect that can last generations and generations. So those are two areas I've seen really a lot of things go wrong, or not refusing to grow up and growing out of, what you used to get joy from. A lot of fathers will party, leave all the time to do their sports or their, activities, and don't really count the cost. And I think it's a little bit of an epidemic, quite honestly.
Yeah. I think I have seen that in people that I've worked with, people I'm friends with, that it's almost I don't know if it's an actual thing, but almost like a Lost Boys syndrome. Lost Boys being from Peter Pan, the island of kids that refuse to grow up. And it's weird because I find myself in that spot occasionally where I'm looking in the rearview mirror about, man, when I was 25, when I was 27, this was great. We could howl at the moon. I could still roll out of bed the next morning and function and do all that stuff. And then age does catch up with you. And at some point, you're the creepy old guy at the fraternity party, where it's like, hey, guess what? Life has passed you by and you're still looking backwards to try to be something that you're no longer.
It's one of the reasons Uncle Rico in Napoleon Dynamite, I don't know if you've seen that, where he's just reliving his football years, his youth over and over again. It's why it's actually so relatable to people.
Yeah.
Because it's so real. I mean, it was to an extreme, of course, but there are people like that, and they're chasing this thing that doesn't exist anymore. You know where the real gift is? The real gift is in the experience of life. The real gift is what you've learned from the past and you have to offer now. Like for me, settling into the role of mentor, like that's really where I love to thrive, is like, if I can speak some life into you and ask you enough questions where it shines a light on you, back on you, like, wait a minute, why am I doing this? Just because I've been through it, then, and telling stories, of course, that's the old guy telling stories, but there's a real rhyme and reason why we're doing that. I just would really encourage men to stop chasing youth and start embracing the experience and the opportunity they have to pass down some insanely incredible things to other people.
Yeah. Yeah, because everybody's got lessons learned. They're hard fought and won and come at a bloody price tag sometimes, bumps and bruises. And if you're not turning around, learning, and then being able to share those with other people, you're missing out. You're missing that role that's appropriate for yourself and something that's really rewarding, stepping into that role of mentor, sage, whatever that is.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pride gets in the way a lot, right? Like if you can step into some humility and realize that your failures are actually a gift to other people. So many men will hold back telling the stories of their failures when really it might be the best teacher. Like telling somebody about, if I were just to sit down with my future grandson and say, hey, I built this business. It's incredibly profitable. I lived a very, very fulfilling financial life, in my late 40s and 50s. And it was really amazing. What is that teaching them? Nothing.
Right.
I have to tell them about how I messed up and told my family we're going to be very tight for a few months. There's no lesson there unless they know how to navigate failures and obstacles and hardships, right?
Yeah.
So like the North Star for grandparents and fathers should be sharing our failures and how we overcame them.
I love that. And that leads me into what I wanted to ask you about next. And I know we'll start to wrap this up soon, but I wanted to get your impression on how older fathers can support and love their sons if their sons need to correct behavior that they're engaged in or trying to make amends to their spouses, families, siblings, etc. Because we all mess up. And I'm not looking for like the one, here's the one thing you got to do. But as you've talked with people that have overcome challenges in their lives, how could fathers and grandfathers be part of that healing process, do you think?
It's actually very simple, but very hard. That is literally getting yourself into opportunities where you can get raw and you can show vulnerability, because vulnerability will tend to be reciprocated. And so one of my friends coined this at my first men's event. He's like, man, everybody came here with they're all puffed up. Everybody's successful. We're all doing our thing. And we all have like this perfect polished armor on. And he said, that's our social armor. He said, what I needed to see and what I saw was when we get up close and personal, that these guys that I think are doing amazing jobs, and this is what we need to do as fathers and grandfathers, is their armor is a mess. It's been bent out of place and bent back into place. It's been pierced. It's scratched. It's dull. It's horrible. But that's because we've gone through things. And as soon as we get rid of the social armor and show our real armor, we're showing that we're humans. And that's where real lessons are learned. That's where if we can be vulnerable and say, hey, like if a grandfather says to his son or to his grandson, I've messed up as a husband. I cheated on your mom, or I did this. What it does is it brings them down to a human level in which now that sharing is reciprocated. And now you've opened this doorway to opportunity to talk how to work through this. And the younger generation will ask, how do I go through this? Because now they know that you're not perfect, because we put all these people up on a pedestal and we don't ever think that they went through hard stuff and messed up. They might tell their stories about going through depression or whatever. But, I didn't know that it was very likely that my mom's grandfather had multiple affairs, right? I didn't know that. But there's so many like lessons in that, because I'm sure that he felt remorse. And if he would have been open about that, maybe there's some conversations could have happened that could have built really amazing foundations for future marriages to be great. And he actually shared some things that really helped in my marriage. But I hope I'm making sense. I think we are intentionally vulnerable, but we have to create the space for that. We have to create the time for that. Fires are an incredible place of mesmerizing, like, and the stars, those are amazing places to generate that. Being out on a lake, hiking, getting out of the populace and going and being with nature are the areas in which you're really showing your true armor. You're really showing the battles you've been through. And that is the gateway to deep and very meaningful and lesson-filled conversations.
Oh, I love that. And it ties in with one of your episodes that I listened to where it was referencing the power of the campfire and that experience. And so I absolutely love that wisdom that you shared with us. And Scott, I've had you on for a while. Is there anything about the Brotherhood of Fatherhood that I haven't asked you that you would like to talk about, or any of the programs that you have that we want to bring up and share with everybody?
I appreciate you asking. I just love if people listen. You know, you've been listening. That's amazing. It's very, very supportive. It's probably the best thing you can do to support. I do have events. They're very small. You know, we try to keep it to 20 guys because when you do those types of things, you want to have a place where there's enough closeness where you can really break through. You know, we shoot guns and we do guy things and big fires and, you know, all the hiking and all the things. But, you know, go check us out on the brotherhoodoffatherhood.com. Listen to the podcast. And that's it, man. I just want people to learn lessons a much easier way than me and many other men have had to learn them. If you can listen to other men's stories, you'll get a lot further in life.
Yeah. Yeah. And folks, if you can't be around a campfire this week, listen to Scott's podcast. It's about the closest that you're going to get to having that power of the campfire in your ears. And so I'll be sure to put links to the Brotherhood of Fatherhood. And also, folks, if you're on Facebook, go check out the Facebook site. Go get involved in that because there's some awesome things that are being shared over in that Facebook group as well.
Yeah, there are. I wish there was more. You know, guys hide a little bit, right? So the more we can share, the better. But it is what it is. But some men will come in and just dump their hearts, and it's quite powerful to watch what happens. Thank you so much. Scott, thanks for being on here. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you have a good rest of the evening. Thank you, Greg. You're doing really, you know, I was talking to my wife about this. I'm going a little longer than you wanted, but you really are doing some really important work, and I really appreciate it. And men, you know, of all ages should really plug in so that they can be intentional about the future of where they're at and how they can impact their families. So thank you. Thanks. I was really grateful that Scott came on my podcast. I enjoyed hearing the stories of his grandfathers, their different experiences, how they approached life differently, as well as how they were able to overcome many of the challenges that so much of that greatest generation had to overcome, going through the Depression, going through World War II, just being out in the rural parts of the country and having to figure out a way to survive. And oftentimes, as you heard, that came with a lot of negative behavior that was brought in that, you know, these guys that were hurting were just trying to cope with. And I've got a lot of sympathy for what they've gone through. What was great is how Scott was able to really connect with each one of them at different levels at different times of his life. I also really enjoyed, and I hope you do too, hearing about Scott's journey with starting the Brotherhood of Fatherhood. And if you haven't already found this incredible resource, I really hope you check it out. Be sure to look on Facebook. We've got a great group going on over there, and Scott does an amazing job of encouraging us to post what's going on with our lives, as well as being able to just post and support each other as we're going through challenges, as well as awesome victories. Go to the show notes and look for all the links regarding Scott and our conversation that I had on Scott's podcast, and be sure to go over and check out the Brotherhood of Fatherhood. So until next time, remember to stay cool.
Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.